across the downtown area. Traffic is light. By mid-afternoon, most schools, offices, and buildings are empty. Some people are shopping. Others are in churches. It is Good Friday. Hello, I'm Joe Whitty. We're about to go back in time to 1964 and relive the worst earthquake ever to hit the Northern Hemisphere. We'll also look at what causes earthquakes, where they're likely to happen, and find out what we learned from the 1964 catastrophe. Alaska sits on one of the most seismic areas of the world. Of the 10 major earthquakes in the 20th century, 3 have struck there. On this particular Good Friday, layers of rock several miles thick, twisted and strained, 12.5 miles beneath the northern shore of Prince William Sound, 80 miles east of Anchorage. Suddenly, the rock gave way, snapping, shifting, setting off the strongest earthquake ever recorded on the North American continent. In Anchorage, at that very moment, Joe Pate was talking into his tape recorder.
Hey, that's an earthquake for sure. Woo! Boy, oh boy, I'll tell you, this is going to get way. Doesn't come up very often up here, but I'm going to it right now. Oh, man, I'm telling you, I've never lived through anything like this before in my life.
The ground surged underfoot in great undulating waves. News of the disaster quickly reached the lower 48 states.
NBC News presents Earthquake, an up-to-the-minute report on the earthquake which has hit Alaska.
A massive heaving of the earth, followed by giant waves of water and an outbreak of fires, has killed an untold number of persons and devastated sections of the Pacific coast from Alaska to California. As of this hour, we know this: Anchorage, 3 known dead, 21 injured. 30 blocks in the heart of the city lie in ruins.
The dimensions of what had happened began to grow. All power sources were disrupted, gas lines broken, water mains destroyed. Streets and roads were blocked by slides and debris. A section of 4th Avenue, the main business thoroughfare, ripped apart. Stores, ground floor offices, and cars along one side of the street dropped a dozen feet.
After that first little wave, there was a terrific storm, and it continued to roll and get harder and harder. I discovered that a whole 2-block area had collapsed and fallen into a hole that it had created itself. The earthquake had simply created a gap where buildings, parked cars, and the street, 4th Avenue, right in downtown Anchorage, had sunk.
At the International Airport, the 68-foot concrete control tower collapsed, but left runways intact. 1 man died in the wreckage. In Valdez, population 1,100, the 10,000-ton cargo freighter SS Chena was alongside the dock, unloading much-needed goods. When the ocean erupted a full 50 feet upward, one of the crew members recorded the drama on his 8mm film camera. "28 people caught on the dock vanished."
When I finally got out of the building with my family, I looked down to where our docks were, and they were no longer there. And I could see the ship was maneuvering to get out into deep water. And I thought to myself, my God, all those folks that were working for us, plus a lot of folks that were down there to watch the ship, which was a kind of a local pastime, to watch the activity, I know that they had no chance of getting off, and that was one of the most sinking feelings I've ever had.
The seas heaved, plunged violently, and set a wall of water in motion. A chain of sea waves, the dreaded tsunami, spread outward in an arc 500 miles long, speeding at between 400 and 500 miles an hour across the Pacific. They struck Vancouver Island, Seattle, California, Hawaii, and even Japan, 4,000 miles away.
At Seward, the damage is great. Fire resulting from a tidal wave devastated the business district and the waterfront.
I just wondered at first if the world hadn't come to an end. I saw this huge wave. It was water, lumber, and debris just coming down like it was just going to engulf me.
The island-located town of Kodiak is reported to be 40% devastated. Reports from there are that a fishing fleet was virtually wiped out.
Crescent City is an incredible scene of devastation caused by the repeated tidal surges from Alaska 1,500 miles to the north. The first tidal wave rolled through an area 5 blocks deep and 14 blocks long in the downtown section. A 5-foot wave of water still carried enough sledgehammer force to knock buildings from their foundations, destroy power facilities, and ruin or damage every building in the downtown section of this lumber and fishing community of 3,000 persons. The fires burned uncontrolled because there is no way for firemen to get to them. Men are searching for wives, wives hunting for husbands.
But Anchorage, Alaska's largest city, a metropolitan area of 100,000 persons, literally straddled the fault line and suffered the most spectacular damage. Using auxiliary power, radio stations were on the air with emergency bulletins.
It is also important that you do not go into the downtown area. You will not be admitted. The downtown area has been blocked off.
A first aid station is being set up at the old First Federal Savings and Loan Building at 5th Avenue and A Street. A doctor is needed there as soon as possible.
Don't sit out in your car. Get under cover now.
All structural and architectural engineers for the U.S. District of Army Engineers are to report to room 111, the District of Engineers building at Elmendorf.
The area is a major disaster area. They have no heat, no fuel, no power.
Bulldozers moved in to knock down some of the more dangerous piles of wreckage. Emergency communications were set up at the Public Safety Building.
Message reporting that an elderly lady, would somebody in that neighborhood please check her home for safety?
Michael Basket, who's 7 years old, can't find him.
Police report that a high-voltage power line is down on Northern Lights Boulevard.
Locate the colonel's wife. Stay off the beaches, stay out of the low areas.
Mr. and Mrs. R.W. Fisher have lost their children. They can't find them. Their home went off the block.
Ambulance sirens merged with the rumbling of Army vehicles as soldiers from nearby Elmendorf Air Force Base and Fort Richardson worked around the clock, searching for survivors, clearing wreckage, rerouting traffic, providing first aid and blankets. Disaster relief required coordination among a half a dozen government agencies.
All water is to be boiled or treated before use. It may be treated by adding to 5 gallons of water 1 teaspoon of chlorine.
Governor William Egan declared martial law and called out the National Guard. Old Providence Hospital, fortunately, suffered only minor damage. Most of the injured were taken there. Anchorage was edgy during the night. No one slept much. Aftershocks continued to shake and rattle the mind more than the ground.
We found a few, precious items.
In a moment, picking up the pieces. Before dawn chilly and misty in Anchorage, the annual Easter egg hunt at Goose Lake was canceled. 3,000 brightly colored eggs were never gathered. There was only time for church and then cleanup.
If you see the building start shaking, then take off.
Easter Sunday in Anchorage was to be a grim day.
Take it easy.
But many people were thankful just to be alive.
Who are in need.
The full extent of structural damage is not yet assessed to apartments, to homes, to schools, and to businesses. Large portions of this city are undamaged, but full power and full phone service are not yet restored, and only parts of Anchorage have water service. Residents are being doled out fresh water supplies where they do not have pure water or any water. Typhoid shots are being given because in many areas, water mains and sewers have been smashed together. There is a 4 p.m. curfew in most of the downtown area.
Downtown was quiet and almost deserted. The ground had shaken for more than 4 minutes. The quake had measured between 8.3 and 8.6 on the Richter scale, had shattered bedrock 12 to 33 miles below the surface. But the miracle would be a surprisingly low number killed and injured. Considering the nearly complete destruction in many areas, the death toll put at only 12 in Anchorage, the injured at 67. Turnagain, by the sea, an exclusive residential section perched on a bluff southwest of the downtown area, huge chunks of cliffs were gouged out, plunging homes into the water. Others were shattered and twisted, left teetering on the brink of the bluff. Home was a pile of stylish rubbish. 25 years later, one resident, Mrs. Tay Thomas, was still recounting her experiences.
We got outside, and we got right onto the snow in the front lawn, and just then we were thrown to the ground. I mean, just violently. There was no way I could stand up. I couldn't believe it. At that point, I realized a black line snaked across between Ann and me in the snow. You know, it's just a jagged black line. And I realized that the ground was breaking up. Then the next thought I had was, gosh, the world must be coming to an end.
Residents returned to look quietly and measure what it would cost to get back to life as it was before. Sometimes the quake itself is the easy part. Coping afterwards can be much harder. The greatest ruin in Anchorage was 4th Avenue, its main street and amusement center. The shock cut the ground out from under a score of buildings. The year-old J.C. Penney department store was the architectural pride of downtown Anchorage. Its front wall crashed into the street, killing 2 people and crushing several cars. One of the more spectacular sights was the wreckage of an almost finished luxury apartment house, due to open within the month. 157 commercial buildings were completely destroyed or rendered unusable. 215 homes were leveled, more than half the city's water lines, 15% of the sewage system, half of the city's streets, curbs, gutters, and sidewalks were severely damaged. In the immediate quake area, bridges, docks, highways, airfields, and the entire railhead of the Alaska Railroad were either damaged or leveled. In Valdez, the entire waterfront had been wiped out. The quake and ocean surge had wrecked most of the commercial buildings and nearly half the houses. Fuel oil tanks were ignited by sparks from severed power lines. 80% of the town was gone, including more than 200 homes. 32 people had died. Near Seward, a major oil port and rail terminus, more mute testimony to the power of quakes and tidal waves. In town, at the railroad terminal yard, diesel locomotives were overturned and the rolling stock was knocked into a tangled mess. 93% of industry was wiped out. 12 people died. Kodiak was hardest hit in terms of human lives, more than 70 people killed. Nearly half the fishing fleet, 77 boats, sunk or badly mauled. Fishing canneries were carried off. The entire landmass sunk 6 to 8 feet. President Lyndon Johnson declared Alaska a major disaster area, granted $5 million in emergency relief funds. Within days, Congress had appropriated $50 million more for reconstruction. The quake had been strong, but in sparsely populated Alaska had primarily struck wilderness. Over the weekend, they buried their dead and began to restore a normal sense of place. The loss of life proved far below first estimates. In all, 131 people had been killed in Alaska, Oregon, and California. The long Easter weekend was over. The Good Friday quake was what scientists called an epic geological event, the largest area ever to be affected by a quake since records began, 100,000 square miles. 75% of Alaska's commerce and industry were ruined, with an estimated loss of $750 million. By the way, that was 100 times more than what it cost the United States to purchase Alaska from Russia in 1867. What did scientists learn from Alaska? Some answers when we come back on Disaster Chronicles. There's a tremor somewhere on the Earth every 30 seconds. Fortunately, 2/3 of all quakes strike under the sea. Of the remainder, most occur in sparsely populated areas. The biggest quakes are most likely along enormous, constantly drifting plates that make up the Earth's crust. The fault is the place where these plates meet. Over the years, movement of these plates causes pressure and stress to build. When the strain becomes intolerable, an earthquake occurs. Since 1964, Alaska has been one of the most intensely studied fault zones in the world. Things happened over such a vast area, 100,000 square miles, and with such force. Geologists have learned much, including a senior research scientist at Columbia University's Lamont Doherty Observatory, Dr. Klaus Jacob.
In the olden times, people really thought of an earthquake as a point on the Earth where something happens. And that earthquake really hit home that these motions are distributed over a very, very large area. The other thing that was really learned is that you better think about very carefully what you built on, whether you built on rock or on soil. And if the soil is sand or silt and water saturated, that this sand may not be soil at the time when you want it, but it may flow away underneath your feet just like water. Third thing was learned that these seismic sea waves are extremely damaging at some coastal areas. Locally, a tsunami, when it rushes towards the coast, increases its height as it approaches the shallower and shallower water level, and the crest of the wave becomes higher and higher in the shallower water. And when it finally hits the coast, it may be tens of feet, sometimes 100 feet high, and envelopes in its breaking wave everything that is in its way. So in Alaska, where there were railroad cars and oil tanks at the coast, or boats that were anchored, they all were wrapped into this motion of water and were carried inland for long distances in a tremendous turmoil. That caused probably the largest damage during the 1964 earthquake.
Anchorage today has a population of about 230,000, more than double that in 1964. Many structures have gone up in the almost 3 decades since. Every so often, the earth trembles, rattling windows, stirring memories, and rekindling debate about how the city was rebuilt.
The problem in Anchorage is that many of the areas that either slid down in these landslides have been partly rebuilt, or some of them actually have been used to put some substantial structures on it. Now, while the structures themselves may perform with regard to shaking reasonably well, the question remains whether the foundations and the soils in which the foundations rest will be stable during the next large earthquake. And I think that Anchorage could have done much better in zoning those areas and eliminate them from building important structures on it. Some attempts have been made, but not everywhere in Anchorage has it been followed through sufficiently.
Anchorage still talks about the Good Friday earthquake, but recollections grow dimmer. Long ago, as people do, residents put their losses behind them and only occasionally dwell on the past. To some geologists, another major earthquake in Alaska is unlikely for generations. To others, like Dr. Jacob, the message is much clearer. Prepare now. If there's one thing we've learned, it's a restless earth. I'm Joe Whitty. See you next time on Disaster Chronicles.